county assessor stood in the doorway, stared at the paired vents cut high and low into opposite walls, and said it plain. "This will not hold." He tapped the upper opening with his knuckle, shook his head, and rode off before the first snow. The builder, a careful man working alone on a newlywed couple's winter cabin in the Nebraska Sandhills, kept measuring, kept cutting, kept stacking the double-wall airlock entry, while neighbors muttered that moisture would pour through those vents like water through a sieve. Then January showed up. The thermometer outside the timbered entry cheek wall dropped 75 degrees in 16 hours, bottomed out at minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And the cabin with the side root cellar hatch and the irori hearth smoke control sat silent in the brittle cold, while the county assessor's words hung high in the frozen air like a dare. The problem wasn't the cold. It was the moisture, every breath, every kettle, every log in the firebox sent into the air, and whether a pair of vents could pull it out before it froze on the walls and brought the whole structure down in a creaking collapse of ice and rot. The builder was a careful man, frugal with lumber and slow to waste a nail, working a contract for a young couple who'd staked a quarter section 2 miles from the nearest neighbor and wanted a cabin that wouldn't kill them by March. He'd built 3 other structures that winter, all conventional, all fine. But this one carried a twist. The couple had asked for Japanese-inspired irori hearth smoke control, a central stone-rimmed firebox that vented up through a flue instead of out a chimney stack. And the builder had agreed on the condition that he could add a high-low vent pair to pull moisture out before it condensed on the logs. The upper vent sat 8 feet off the floor. The lower vent hugged the foundation on the opposite wall, and together they were supposed to create a gentle convection loop, warm, damp air rising and escaping high, while cold, dry air entered low and cycled through. The county assessor, a skeptic by nature and a man convinced that every experiment ended in an insurance claim, had ridden out in November, studied the framing, and delivered his verdict with the certainty of someone who'd seen too many cabins collapse under ice load. This will not hold. Moisture will freeze in those vents, block them shut, and you'll wake up to frost an inch thick on every wall. The builder nodded, said nothing, and kept working. The cabin went up in 6 weeks. The builder started with a 12 by 16 foot footprint, sank corner posts into holes dug below the frost line, and framed the walls with green cottonwood logs he'd hauled from a creek bed 5 miles south. The timbered entry cheek wall, a short interior partition that forced anyone entering to turn sideways before reaching the main room, went in first, creating a natural cold trap that kept drafts from hitting the firebox directly. Then came the massive double-vestibule entry, 2 heavy doors spaced 4 feet apart, with drift boards nailed horizontally between them to shed snow. The outer door got a rope-wrapped door pull, thick hemp wound tight, so a man in icy gloves could grip it without fumbling, and the inner door swung on leather hinges, greased with tallow. The side root cellar hatch, a trapdoor set flush with the floor near the south wall, dropped into a shallow dugout pit where the couple could store potatoes and turnips without them freezing solid. The builder lined the pit with fieldstone, capped it with split planks, and moved on to the vents. The upper vent measured 6 inches square, cut through the north wall just below the roofline, and fitted with a simple wooden louver that could be opened or closed with a leather thong. The lower vent, same size, sat 18 inches off the floor on the south wall, directly opposite, and got an identical louver. The builder caulked the edges with a mix of clay and prairie grass, left the louvers open, and waited for someone to complain. The county assessor arrived 2 days later, studied the vents with his arms crossed, and delivered his line. "This will not hold. You've just given every drop of moisture a straight shot to freeze on your walls." The builder, who'd read a translated manual on Japanese farmhouse ventilation systems and trusted the physics more than he trusted the assessor's intuition, thanked him for stopping by and went back to shingling the roof. The assessor rode off shaking his head, and the neighbors, who'd gathered to watch the exchange, muttered among themselves that the builder had finally built something too clever for his own good. The Japanese-inspired irori hearth smoke control system went in next. The builder dug a shallow pit in the center of the main room, lined it with flat river stones, and built a low stone rim around the perimeter to contain embers. Instead of venting straight up through an open smoke hole like a tippy, the irori used a short iron chimney pipe that angled up and out through the roof, creating a controlled draw that pulled smoke upward without letting a column of warm air pour out wastefully. The pipe sat offset from the fire by 2 feet, mounted on a simple iron bracket, and the builder capped it with a rain shield he'd hammered out of scrap tin. The system worked because the fire burned in the open, radiating heat evenly into the room, while the chimney pipe only pulled what rose naturally, creating a slow, steady draft instead of a roaring upward rush. The result was a firebox that burned 71% of its fuel into usable heat instead of sending half of it up a wide chimney. And the builder, who'd calculated the efficiency by weighing ash and timing burn rates, knew the numbers would matter when January arrived. The builder finished the cabin in mid-December, moved his tools into the root cellar, and spent 2 days splitting cordwood to stack against the exterior walls under a canvas tarp. He cut the wood short, each piece 16 inches long, so it would fit neatly into the firebox without crowding the edges, and he sorted it by species, stacking cottonwood for quick heat and oak for overnight coals. The fuel wall, a U-shaped barricade of stacked wood running along 3 sides of the cabin, served as both insulation and emergency reserve. And the builder calculated that the couple had enough dry wood to burn continuously for 8 weeks without restocking. He tied the tarp down with hemp rope, checked the louvers on both vents to make sure they opened freely, and rode into town to file the completion report. The county assessor, sitting behind his desk with a ledger open, glanced at the paperwork and asked the same question he'd asked in November. "Those vents going to hold?" The builder said he'd find out soon enough, signed the report, and rode home. January arrived on a Tuesday with clear skies and a temperature of 20 degrees Fahrenheit, mild enough that the builder spent the morning hauling water from a spring a quarter-mile north and checking the chimney cap for ice buildup. By Wednesday, the temperature had dropped to 10 degrees. By Thursday, it hit 0. And by Friday morning, the thermometer outside the vestibule read -12 degrees Fahrenheit. The builder, who'd moved into the cabin to test it before handing it over to the couple, kept the irori fire burning low and steady, feeding it 2 logs every 4 hours, and letting the coals settle between loadings. The high-low vent pair stayed open, louvers angled to catch the airflow, and the builder watched the walls for frost. None appeared. The upper vent pulled warm, damp air out in a slow, continuous stream, visible as a faint shimmer in the cold outside air, while the lower vent drew in cold, dry air that sank to the floor and cycled upward as it warmed. The system created a gentle loop, the air moving just fast enough to carry moisture out without pulling heat wastefully. And the builder, who'd measured the interior humidity with a wet rag and a hanging weight, calculated that the cabin was exhausting roughly 2 pounds of water vapor every 24 hours. That was the difference. A conventional cabin with no ventilation would trap that moisture. let it condense on the coldest surfaces, and within a week, the walls would be slick with frost, and the roof beams would be dripping ice melt every time the fire flared. This cabin stayed dry. Friday afternoon, the wind shifted, coming hard out of the northwest, and by sunset, the temperature had started to fall in earnest. The builder added an extra log to the fire, closed the louvers halfway to reduce the draft, and settled in to wait. By midnight, the thermometer read -20 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 in the morning, it hit -30 degrees Fahrenheit. By dawn on Saturday, it bottomed out at -38 degrees Fahrenheit. And the builder woke to the sound of the roof beams creaking under the cold. He checked the walls first, running his hand over the logs near the ceiling and along the floor, where frost would form first if the vents had failed. The wood was dry, cold but not frozen. And when he held a candle near the upper vent, he could see the flame lean outward as warm air escaped. The system was working. The lower vent, when he crouched beside it, pulled cold air inward with enough force that he could feel it on his wrist. And the builder, who'd worried that the extreme cold might freeze the louvers shut, found them still moving freely on their leather hinges. He opened both louvers fully, fed the fire another log, and waited for the sun to rise. The sun came up pale and distant, casting long blue shadows across the patchy snow, and the temperature held steady at -38 degrees Fahrenheit until noon. The builder spent the morning inside, feeding the fire every 3 hours and watching the vents. The high-low vent pair pulled moisture out so efficiently that when he exhaled near the upper vent, his breath vanished into the airflow before it could condense. And when he set a kettle on the edge of the firebox to boil water for tea, the steam rose, circled, and disappeared through the upper louver, without tea leaving a trace on the walls. The irori hearth, burning at 71% efficiency, consumed 1 log every 2 hours and kept the interior temperature at a steady 55 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to work without gloves and cold enough that the builder didn't sweat. The fuel wall outside, stacked high and covered with a canvas tarp, sat untouched except for the small pile the builder had brought inside the previous evening. And by mid-afternoon, he calculated that he'd burned through less than 10% of the reserve wood in the first week. That mattered. A conventional cabin burning at 40% efficiency would have gone through twice as much wood in the same period. And by the end of January, the couple would have been hauling emergency loads in a blizzard or freezing in their sleep. Saturday afternoon, the wind picked up again, gusting hard enough to rattle the canvas tarp on the fuel wall, and the builder went outside to check the tie-downs. The tarp had shifted slightly, one corner pulling loose where the hemp rope had stretched under repeated freeze-thaw cycles, and the builder retied it with a double knot, adding an extra loop around the nearest log. While he worked, he noticed the eaves starting to ice, thin, clear ridges forming where the roof overhang trapped moisture from the escaping chimney smoke. And he made a mental note to scrape them clean before they grew heavy enough to pull the shingles loose. The temperature held at -38 degrees Fahrenheit through the afternoon, rose briefly to -30 degrees Fahrenheit at dusk, and then dropped again after dark. The builder fed the fire, adjusted the louvers to compensate for the increased wind pressure, and went to bed with the sound of the roof beams creaking in the cold. Sunday morning, he woke to the sound of something tearing. The fuel wall tarp had come loose again, this time pulling free along the entire north edge, and the wind had caught it like a sail, snapping it back and forth hard enough to scatter split logs across the snow. The builder dressed fast, grabbed the rope, and went outside into air so cold it burned his throat. The temperature had dropped overnight to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees colder than the lowest reading the builder had recorded all winter. And the tarp, now stiff with frost, tore further as he wrestled it back into place. He retied it with fresh rope, doubled the loops, and weighted the edges with logs heavy enough that the wind couldn't lift them. By the time he finished, his hands were numb despite the gloves. And when he ducked back inside the cabin, the warmth from the irori fire felt like a wall of heat against his face. He checked the vents immediately. Both were still pulling air, the upper vent exhausting a steady stream of warm moisture, and the lower vent drawing in cold, dry air that sank to the floor and cycled upward. The walls were dry, the roof beams were dry, and the builder, who'd half expected to find frost forming despite the vents, realized that the evening the roof creaked and the brace held without shifting had been the turning point. The system had passed its test. The temperature stayed below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 more days. The builder burned through another section of the fuel reserve, kept the vents open, and watched the walls. No frost formed. The irori fire, fed steadily and never allowed to flare wastefully, consumed wood at a rate that left the builder confident the couple could survive the winter on the stacked reserve alone without needing to venture out in dangerous cold. By Wednesday, the temperature had climbed back to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By Thursday, it hit 0, and by Friday morning, it was back above 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Still cold, but manageable. The builder spent Friday checking every joint and seam in the cabin, looking for signs of stress or damage from the extreme cold, and found none. The timbered entry cheek wall had held without cracking. The massive double-vestibule entry doors still swung freely on their leather hinges. The rope-wrapped door pull had stayed flexible despite the frost, and the side root cellar hatch opened smoothly when he tested it. The high-low vent pailouvers, which he'd worried might freeze shut or warp under the temperature swing, moved as freely as they had in December. And when he climbed onto the roof to scrape the ice from the eaves, he found the shingles intact and the chimney cap clear of buildup. Friday afternoon, the county assessor rode out again, this time without announcing his visit, and found the builder splitting kindling outside the cabin. The assessor dismounted, studied the cabin for a long moment, and then walked a slow circle around the structure, checking the walls, the vents, and the fuel reserve. When he reached the upper vent, he stopped, put his hand near the opening, and felt the warm air escaping. He said nothing. When he reached the lower vent, he crouched, felt the cold air being pulled inward, and still said nothing. Finally, he walked to the fuel wall, lifted the edge of the tarp, counted the remaining logs, and turned to face the builder. "How much wood have you burned?" The builder, who'd kept a tally scratched into a piece of bark, gave him the number. 63 logs in 12 days. The assessor did the math in his head, frowned, and asked the question he'd come to ask. How was that possible? The builder explained the irori hearth, the 71% efficiency, the controlled draw that burned wood slowly and completely, instead of sending half the heat up a wide chimney. He explained the high-low vent pair, the convection loop that pulled moisture out without pulling heat wastefully, and the way the system had kept the walls dry even when the temperature hit minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The assessor listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when the builder finished, the assessor nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The next week, 2 neighbors rode out, both men who'd built conventional cabins within 5 miles, and both men who'd heard through the county office that the builder's experimental vent system had survived the coldest week in memory, without frosting over. They asked to see the vents, asked how the irori hearth worked, and asked how much wood the builder had burned. The builder showed them everything, walking them through the cabin and explaining the convection loop, the moisture exhaust, the fuel efficiency calculations, and the way the double vestibule entry and the timbered cheek wall worked together to trap cold air before it reached the firebox. One of the neighbors, a man who'd lost 2 weeks of work in January chipping frost off his cabin walls, asked if the builder would add vents to his structure. The other neighbor asked the same question. The builder said he'd come out in March, after the worst of the winter had passed, and they rode off satisfied. By mid-February, the temperature had stabilized in the teens and 20s, cold but not life-threatening, and the builder began preparing to hand the cabin over to the couple. He spent 2 days restocking the fuel wall, hauling fresh loads of split wood from his own reserve and stacking them neatly under the tarp. He cleaned the chimney pipe, scraped the soot from the inside of the firebox, and oiled the leather hinges on both vestibule doors. He checked the side root cellar hatch, found the potatoes and turnips still firm and unfrozen, and replaced the split planks covering the pit with fresh ones he'd planed smooth. He tested the rope-wrapped door pull, found it still flexible and grip-friendly, and added an extra layer of hemp wrap for good measure. When he finished, he walked the perimeter of the cabin one last time, checking for any detail he might have missed, and found nothing. The cabin was ready. The couple arrived on a Saturday morning in late February, riding a wagon loaded with furniture and supplies, and the builder met them outside the cabin to hand over the keys. He walked them through the structure room by room, explaining the irori hearth, demonstrating the high-low vent pair, and showing them how to adjust the louvers depending on the wind and temperature. He showed them the timbered entry cheek wall, the massive double vestibule entry system, the rope-wrap door pull technique, and the side root cellar hatch access procedure. He explained the fuel efficiency calculations, the moisture exhaust principles, and the importance of keeping the vents clear of ice and debris. The couple listened carefully, asked a few questions, and thanked him for the work. The builder shook hands, climbed onto his horse, and rode back to town, leaving them to settle in. March arrived with warming temperatures and occasional thaws, and the builder began making the rounds to the neighbors who'd asked about adding vents to their cabins. He measured, cut, and installed high-low vent pairs in 4 structures over the course of 3 weeks, each one following the same basic design as the original cabin, but adjusted for the specific dimensions and firebox placement of the existing buildings. In every case, the results were immediate. Walls that had been slick with frost dried out within days, fuel consumption dropped by 30 to 40%, and the interior air, which had been thick and stale, cleared and freshened. One neighbor, a man who'd been skeptical until he saw the results, asked the builder to add a second pair of vents to his barn to keep the livestock from developing respiratory problems in the cold. The builder agreed, installed the vents in 2 days, and the neighbor reported that the barn stayed dry and warmer, with less hay burned for bedding heat. By April, the word had spread through the county office, and the builder began receiving requests from families as far as 20 miles away. He spent the spring traveling from cabin to cabin, installing vents, explaining the principles, and training other builders on the technique. By summer, he'd retrofitted 32 structures, built 6 new cabins with the high-low vent pair system integrated from the start, and written a short instructional manual that the county office copied and distributed to anyone who asked. The manual explained the physics in plain language, included diagrams of the vent placement and louver construction, and listed the fuel efficiency gains that could be expected based on the size of the structure and the type of firebox. The county assessor, who'd gone from skeptic to quiet supporter, filed the manual in the official records and noted in his year-end report that winter survival rates in the district had improved measurably since the high-low vent pair innovation had been introduced. The couple in the original cabin sent word in May that they'd made it through the winter without any frost damage, without running out of fuel, and without needing to leave the cabin during the worst of the cold. They reported that the high-low vent pair had worked exactly as the builder had promised, that the irori hearth had burned wood so efficiently they'd ended the winter with a third of the fuel reserves still stacked and unused, and that the rope-wrapped door pull had been a lifesaver on mornings when their NDs were too cold to grip bare metal. They asked if the builder could add a second root cellar and expand the vestibule to accommodate a small workshop, and the builder agreed to start the work in June. The builder spent the summer expanding his operations, training 2 apprentices on the high-low vent pair technique, and experimenting with variations on the irori hearth design. He built 1 cabin with a double firebox, 2 separate irori pits that could be burned independently or together depending on the weather, and another cabin with an elevated hearth that sat 2 feet off the floor to reduce the risk of embers escaping onto wooden planks. Both designs worked. Both passed the winter test the following year, and both were documented in updated versions of the instructional manual. By the following spring, the builder had installed high-low vent pairs in over 100 structures across 3 counties, and the technique had become standard practice for any new cabin being built in the region. The county assessor, who'd ridden out that first Friday in November to deliver his verdict that the vents would not hold, never apologized directly, but in his year-end report, he wrote a single line that the builder read and filed away without comment. The high-low vent pair moisture control system has proven effective under extreme conditions and is recommended for adoption in all new construction. That was as close to an admission as the assessor would ever give, and the builder, who'd never needed the validation, took it as confirmation that the physics had won out over skepticism. The system worked because the principles were sound. The execution was careful, and the testing had been thorough. That was enough. The following winter tested the system again, though not as severely as the first year. The temperature dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit in January, held there for 5 days, and then climbed back to more manageable levels. The builder, who by then had moved on to other projects, received word from a dozen families that their cabins had stayed dry, their fuel reserves had lasted, and the high-low vent pairs had performed exactly as designed. One family reported that their neighbor's conventional cabin had developed such severe frost buildup that the walls had started to rot by February, while their own cabin, retrofitted with vents the previous spring, showed no damage at all. The contrast was stark enough that the neighbor tore down his cabin in March and hired the builder to construct a replacement with the vent system, integrated from the start. By the 3rd winter, the high-low vent pair moisture control system had become so widespread that the builder stopped keeping track of installations and focused instead on refining the technique for larger structures. He designed a variant for 2-story cabins that used a 3-vent system, 1 low intake on the ground floor and 2 high exhausts on the upper floor, and another variant for barns that placed the vents near the animal stalls to reduce humidity from livestock breath and manure decomposition. Both variants worked, both were documented, and both were adopted quickly by families who'd seen the results of the original system. The original cabin, the one built for the newlywed couple in the winter of '72, stood for decades afterward, its walls dry and its structure sound, a quiet proof that the system worked. The builder moved on to other projects, other innovations, other winters, but the high-low vent pair remained his most widely adopted design, copied and modified across the plains wherever cold winters and tight cabins demanded a solution to the moisture problem. The county assessor never rode out to inspect it again, and the builder never asked him to. The physics had spoken, and the system had held. The end.